please. My name is Stefan Olsson, and I'm the director for the Stockholm Free World Forum. I would just like to say that if you're interested in what we do and would like to have our emails, you can sign up for on our email list, and you go to our website. It's frivarld.se. And on our website, you can also find recordings from today's session. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this announcement from our sponsors. Welcome back, and we will now move into the final part of these keynote lectures. And continuing on the question of issue of Islam and democracy and liberty, it's Dr. Eli Gunder. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I want to start somewhere in the middle where Dr. Magnus Norell was talking about the relations between the West and the Arab world. It was recently a book published by a scholar called Telhami. And the title of the book was The World Through Arab Eyes. And there is a point to, if you read that book, the book is interviews and research made on what the Arab population in the Middle East thinks about West, the United States. And there is a point to the attitudes towards West where there is some sort of gathering against West when, for instance, United States is going in to do something or has the attempt to make order in the Middle East. Saying that, what we're talking about here is, in this case, or what I'm supposed to talk about is Islam. Islam is not only in the Middle East. A minority of Muslims live in the Middle East. Islam is much bigger than that. So there is a danger in seeing Islam only as a result of what happens in the Middle East, to start with. Secondly, I want to rephrase what I'm supposed to talk about. So I don't want to talk about Islam and democracy, and the reason for that is, it's actually two reasons. One is that the word democracy, or the meaning of democracy, is such a broad discussion, what it could be, what it can mean, and so on. So I rather talk about Islam and freedom, or Islam and liberty. And I believe that the contradiction, or the contradiction made between those two ideas, are artificial. I don't see any contradiction. And the reason why I don't see any contradiction starts with the fact that my claim is, not only my claim, but in this case my claim is that Islam is not an independent entity. It's not something that hangs around the world and tells people what to do. Islam, as any other religion, always becomes the result of who practices it. And that is, by the way, a sentence that you gave me a couple of years ago at Sturehof, if you remember. You do. Huh? I was not so early part of the dinner, yeah. So my claim is actually that Islam will, in with certain limits, always become what those who practice Islam will do of it. And being a good Muslim in that case could be just about anything. Saying that, in that case, I claim that the person that goes out and says that he wants to do jihad and blows himself up in with civilians is a Muslim as good as a Muslim that does the opposite thing. No one can have the claim that that is a bad Muslim or that is a good Muslim, because their interpretation of Islam is the way it is. But if you take a look of how Islam is practiced around the world, you see that there is huge differences in practice between different Muslims in different places of the world. And if there is a necessity or if there is a reason, or if there is a social context that requires Islam to be, or Islam to get an interpretation or a practice that would adjust to freedom or other types of societies, then it will do so. So what you actually can say, what Muslim scholars have said, is that when Muslims want to be free, or when Muslims want to have a democracy, they will make an interpretation of Islam that would suit that system. Doesn't say that all the Muslims would think the same, doesn't say that all the Muslims would agree to that. And that is maybe the strongest argument of the fact that Islam is not a set system that forces people to do certain things. It's very close to what was said before about culture. It's not a set frame. It develops in different ways. We have differences. Things that were totally impossible a couple of years ago when it concerns the interpretation of Islam is today possible. And I want to take up a couple of arguments for the idea that I'm trying to present, that Islam is a result of those who practice it, and by that there is no reason why Islam shouldn't be why Islam shouldn't be practiced in systems that are free, or why necessarily Islam should be a religion that only is connected with systems that are non-free. One of the things to measure a society is how the society treats women, or the options of women as far as concerns freedom of speech, or right to work, or education, and so on. In that case, if you look at Muslim societies, situation for women are not that great, or even worse than that, it's very, very bad in some areas. On the other hand, what we see is a development where women are taking more and more space in Muslim environments, or in Muslim societies. Everybody by now knows Malala Yousafzai from Pakistan and her story. And she illustrates something. It's not only about her, and it's not only about what she did. And you can see it in two different ways. One way is to see that woman that wasn't given the right to study. The other way to see it is to understand that group, or that movement of women that are taking more and more space in with the Muslim world, is creating something in the Muslim societies. Something happens. Because if there are people, or men in this case, that feel themselves so threatened from a 15-year-old girl that wants to go to school, that they decide to shoot her, it says something about the movement that she represents. Or rather, it says something about the threat that they feel about the movement that she represents. Women like that, or what goes for women in Muslim worlds all over the world, is that women all over in Muslim societies are getting more education. They are marrying much later, and they are delivering much fewer children than their parents did. If you look to recent research done, that I don't think I have the name on right here and now, all over, if you look all over all those societies that are defined as Muslim, there is a decline of deliveries with 50% all over. So there half as many children right now for the last 20 years than it was 20 years ago. Women that are taking a larger space in with Muslim societies are also the reason why these Muslim societies have to redefine themselves. There have to be a redefinition of the view on women. There has to be a redefinition of how society see other people, especially women's role in society, education for women. And that creates new situations also as far as concerns how Islam is understood, even by scholars. One of the reactions on the murder or the attempt to kill Malala was, for instance, that 50 Muslim scholars, right after the murder, claimed the fatwa, like a legal Muslim claim, that there was nothing in Islam that justified the shooting of Malala. Here you have religious authorities that actually went against those who decided that she should be shot at. We have movements in Saudi Arabia. And if we look today in the area of the Middle East and Muslim women in the Middle East, we can see that, for instance, during the 60s, not more than 1 to 5% of women worked outside their home or outside their own land as farmers. Around year 2000, 40 years later, between 30 and 60% of the women was working outside the house. One other thing that is very important as far as concerns the Muslim world altogether is social media, Facebook, Twitter, internet, and so on. There is a dramatic increase in education in the Muslim world on one hand, and on the other hand, there is a destruction, a total destruction of the traditional authorized religious hierarchies. One goes with the other, which means the more educated people are, the less they are interested in unqualified leaders or leaders that can't meet their demands as educated people. So today, religious authorities with Islam that could treat people or move people around the way they want because they can read and others can't, doesn't function anymore. The destruction of the traditional hierarchies and the rise of education and with the Muslim worlds have created a situation where in that vacuum, in that open space, there are a lot of different ideas that are competing with one another, and there we have the most radical ones and extremist ones on one hand, but we have all the other ideas as well. And that development creates not only good, but also bad, but it creates a new development which requires reevaluation of what Islam is and what Islam has to be and how Islam should live, or how people should live with their faith, and how Islam in general should be understood in a new in those new societies or the new situation that these societies are in right now. If you look at and I assume that many of you have seen it, there was a survey done by Pew Research that is called The World's Muslims, Religion, Politics and Society, where they were made 38,000 interviews in 80 different languages, was asking Muslims what they feel and believe about their religion and their own attitude towards their religious identity and so on. And what's astonishing about that report is how different it is, how different Muslims see themselves, their religion, their attitude towards religion, their attitude towards the religion in relation to freedom, and so on. And I actually claim that because of these differences, and because of the very dramatic developments, actually since the 80s, we don't know actually where Islam is heading for, but what we do know is that there is no reason why Islam could be have a different interpretation that it has had so far by its practitioners. So the question that we end up to actually before I conclude this is, okay, if that is the case, how come then that there are so many countries where the majority is Islamic or the majority of population are Muslims and these countries are not free? If it's the way that I'm claiming, that there is no contradiction between Islam or practicing of Islam and freedom, why are so many countries that has a majority of Muslims not free? It's a legitimate question. My claim to that is, and I looked through that when I had the privilege of writing the report for Free World Forum about Muslims in the world. The question is how you see the way society is built up, and I'm not dealing with political science. I'm not an expert on it, so this is a very humble opinion from my point of view. But traditionally, there has been an idea that says that that you divide society into formal and informal institutions, or formal and non-formal institutions. And if the civil society is a good one, which means if people in civil society are good and they have good ideas, and for a long period of time it was even connected to what would be called Judeo-Christian values, then finally you would have formal institutions that would work well. But lately, even in political science, that idea has changed. And the idea is actually saying that if you have formal institutions that work well, that protects people in the way that their ownership is protected, that their freedom is protected, that the system allows people to build up a civil society in some way that can take care of itself, then that is what's required. It goes the other way around. It doesn't go from the informal institutions up to formal institutions, because formal institutions that are good are required for people to be able to create good informal institutions. So if you look at the political traditions in those countries that have majority of Muslims, then we have a long history of dictatorship, we have a long history of people that are not allowed to gain individual power, where the rulers in many cases are limiting people for developing themselves and the informal institutions. So the political systems in those different countries are actually the ones that have created this unfree Muslim world that we see, and not the religion necessarily. So finally, to conclude what I'm saying, there is one more thing to it also, and that is if you look through, and I used a Swedish professor in political science called Jan Theorell, which was a book I was given by Stefan Olsson when I did this, that actually claims that you can see some countries that have limited, that are limited in their freedom, or haven't been able to develop freedom or systems that are free, have something in common. One of the things that they have in common is that they lean on natural resources for their economy, for instance. Another thing is that the countries are big as far as concerns space, and a third thing is internal conflicts. The countries are not stable, dictatorships and so on. All these different aspects that he's taken up as limits for freedom are those that we find in non-democratical Muslim countries or non-free Muslim countries that we see today, and that have been and that are very obvious. So to conclude this, if you look through these numbers, or if you look through these reports that I have mentioned during my speech, you will see that there is no reason why Islam shouldn't be able to, or why Islam shouldn't be able, or Muslims shouldn't be able to live in a free society, even if they are religious, even if they are traditional. And there is no reason why Islam by Muslims shouldn't be understood as or understood or adjusted into free systems the same way as other religions have been done. I mean, if you look at the history of Christianity, or if you look, Judaism is a little bit different, because Judaism never had an ambition to rule the world. Actually, it depends on who you ask, but but there hasn't been there hasn't been any active missionary in with Judaism, as where Christianity and Islam has gone out and tried to create a world of Christians and a world of Muslims. So, but that tradition, or that was one way of seeing the religion, and the way the Middle East is changing, and the way certain areas of Asia is changing, and so on, there will be requirements to interpret Islam in another way, and there is no reason why that shouldn't happen, as well as it has happened with Christianity, for instance.
Thank you so much, Eli. In order to be fair, and before we let the panelists from the former sessions come up to the podium, you should also have a moment of your own of questions and comments. And let me start with about the point you made about the Muslim women taking place in society. Not only obviously through education, but also actually through, if it's sustainable, political democratic institutions. I mean, democratic in the narrow sense. The AKP, which was mentioned by someone here in Turkey, actually very much depended on mobilizing its women's branch in order to, using its women branch in order to mobilize female voters, because male political activists could not knock on doors on traditional suburbs or the local hinterland of Turkey. So they had to send women activists. So the women activists of the party were actually delivering half of the votes, more or less. But they had no say in the institutions of the party initially. But now recently, actually, and the party was also very careful of, for example, not having headscarfed women as candidates in order not to have the discussion about the, because the parliament didn't allow headscarves. So there was actually a big pressure from the women's organization and female activists within the party, since they were delivering so many votes and had this crucial role in mobilizing voters. Why didn't have more say on their issues, on honor killings, on family violence within the family, on education of girls, and also of headscarves? So it doesn't always have to be necessarily about liberal institutions. It can also be about democratic processes, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's I totally agree with what you're saying. I would add to that though that some of these institutions not always have the interest of liberating women. There is sometimes a contradiction. There is a research made by Sabah Mahmoud in Egypt, where she looked into the Muslim Brotherhood's schools for women. So the Muslim Brotherhood has special schools for women that are handled by women to educate women in their religious rights. But those schools also have an interest in limiting the women in with the religious framework or the understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood where women should be. What she says, though, is that when women are creating that first platform of understanding and reading, then there is no way back. So from here, they take the next step. I have my own experience when I did my research for my PhD thesis, when I interviewed Muslim women in Israel, and I had it on the title of my book, I Can Understand and Read by Myself. That's the title of the book. If you ask these women, who is your religious authority? Who are your authorities? They say, I don't need any authority. I can read by myself. So on one hand, it's right what you're saying. Women are used in some sense, and then when the issue is over, they are sent back to their original place. You even have that at Tahrir Square, for instance. You have that at the Palestinian Society, when women were organized as a part of the Intifada and also by the Hamas and so on. And then when the whole Intifada or the clash with Israel was over, then the women were sent back home again. So the process is not going in only one direction. But what Sabah Mahmoud is saying, that when they finally reach that platform, or the first level, the understanding of what education means, and create the situation where their saying can't be neglected because they have something to lean on, their own education, then what you're talking about, then the next step is inevitable. I mean, no one can stop them anymore.
So the pattern of unintended consequences, in a way.
Yeah.
Mm. There was someone, please. Now, well, do you want me to give away my microphone? I'm the moderator.
Thank you. That leaves a lot of freedom to me. Well, yes, thank you. No, a question: if you share, or if you would, I assume that you're aware of the Muslim feminist Ishad Manji and her book, The Problem of Islam, where she states that, as I understand, at least her view is that Islam will not change until there is a change within the structure, obviously a paternalistic structure in the in the religion of Islam of today that is in some ways similar to the Christian structure, you know, 800 years ago when the Reformation came along with Martin Luther, etc., and so on. If you share her view that the Muslim world, Islam, will not change until there is a similar movement within the religion of Islam, or if you have another view on this. So that said, do you see anything, a change of this kind upcoming?
Then you can move in, Ellen. Yes.
Yeah, my question is partly similar to your question. Is partly similar to your question. So the question is Sharia law. I'm a lawyer, and how it could affect constitutional legislation in Muslim countries, and whether this is compatible with a certain notion of democracy.
Thank you. And finally.
This is more of a comment than a question. I was thinking, if you look back into the 1950s and 60s, political scientists working on democratization and the consolidation of democratization were very seriously debating whether Catholics would ever be able to be true Democrats. And I'm thinking this might add some perspective to this issue as well.
Okay, if we start with Irsha Manji, I basically agree with her. The question is, the question is why it haven't happened, and what she thinks will make it happen. I think we're not 100% agree on that. There is a problem with Irsha Manji. I want to say that first of all. Some of these, like Irsha Manji, and even Malala in this case, and so on, is very often understood as something unique in the Muslim world. They claim, and they make a claim, and these are, or she is the only woman that have that saying, and she is the only one. Irsha Manji is one of many, but she has the ability to write it and be outspoken. I respect her tremendously because she wants to be a religious and devoted Muslim. She's fighting for Islam, and she wants to stay that way. And the opposite to no, I forgot her name. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who says that Islam is finished, don't deal with it anymore. So Irsha Manji, she's talking about ijtihad, Irsha Manji in her book, and she's saying that when the door to ijtihad, the like rephrasing of Islam or interpreting in Islam in different ways, or seeing Islam from different angles, or be able to give the laws of Islam or the understanding of Islam another interpretation that is adjusted to our world. At the same time, the door to ijtihad was closed. Islam lost its ability to develop. Maybe so. I still believe that when Islam will have to change, doesn't matter which country right now, because Islam has to survive in a new environment, then the scholars, or even not the scholars, Muslims will find a way to keep their religion and tradition in the new environment. Again, because the texts are still there. And there is no force from above Islam that forces people to stay where they are. So whether ijtihad has been forgotten or not, common sense says that when Muslims will be in a situation in the environment where they have to adjust their religion to the new society or to the new situation to be able to keep their religion and tradition, then they will do it. As far as concerns Sharia laws in that case and freedom, I want to go back to Telhami in that case. Telhami has made the research, and what he discovers there is that most of the Muslims in the Middle East want the societies to be built on Sharia. Okay? Sounds problematic. Now, if you look into that research and you start looking at the questions and so on, you discover that the fact that they want the society to be ruled by Sharia doesn't mean that they don't want freedom. They want to be free, and they want to have Sharia. How do you do that? Because their understanding of Sharia is that that's the system they know and understand. That is what exists. Don't forget that democracy, or Western understood democracy, is based on our understanding of freedom. So for their point of view, they don't want clergy or religious authorities to rule them. They want as little religious authorities as possible to rule them. And they want to be free. So the only way to understand that is that the Muslim world, at least in the Middle East, want the Sharia, because that is what they know and understand, to be explained or adjusted into a free system that will give them the freedom that they want and get rid of as many religious authorities as possible at the same time. And again, as I said, if people would move that way, then that is what will happen, because the law book or Sharia or Islam itself is not an independent entity that comes up from above and decides what people should do. It's people that create their own environment.
So thank you so much, and then let's invite the other panelists to the podium and broaden the discussion. And you are also free, of course, to go back to topics. So I will try to accommodate Russia, China, Islamic extremism, liberalism, all at the same time. And let me just show you my cufflinks. So civilizations don't have to be in conflict. They can also be together. So just something I prepared especially for this occasion. Eli, I think to start with what you finished with your part of the session, I think it's a question of, isn't it a question of plasticity of the large religions, in a way that they have actually been surviving for some of them several thousand years, and a couple of them 2,000, one of them 2,000 years, another 1,400 years, by being able to adapt to different social circumstances and changes of culture and civilizations, since they are world religions in the sense. And Judaism is also more or less a world religion, because it's as much as represented today in Brooklyn as in the Middle East. I guess that if division of powers is necessary, then some Muslim scholar will say, well, it's according with Sharia to have division of power.
I would totally agree to that also. I would also say, and I wanted to add to that, and that maybe Magnus Norell can add up on, I believe that one of the reasons why we see extreme, radical, violent Islam the way we see it, where we see it, has a lot to do with very weak formal institutions. Where you have strong formal institutions, where the society works, they don't have the space there. They can try to destroy it. But the stronger the formal institutions are, the weaker they get. And if you look today, most of the countries, if I'm not wrong, or most of the areas where extreme radical Islam is claiming space, is where the formal institutions are very weak.
You want me to come?
Yeah, to jump in. Also, actually, from other civilizations than necessarily Islamic.
Yeah, I would agree to that. I think you know the power of formal, is, as you say, political institutions are extremely important. I would, however, it's not black and white, but I think a more important question here is actually a very classical political science idea, and is the separation of powers. You keep them separate. If you wanna a real democracy, real democracy, you really do have to separate religion from politics, in the formal sense that no religion can be on top of sort of the defining idea of what politics should be about. I would argue that strongly. So you need that too, which is not, still formal institutions are extremely important, precisely as you say. But in order to reach that, you really do need that kind of basic, fundamental separation of powers.
Well, if I on formal institutions, if I change the direction a little bit to my field, then it's I think that's exactly the core problem in China today, that the formal institutions don't function the way they're supposed to. And I think if there's something we can learn in the European debate about cultural policy from the Chinese situation, it's this, because it tends to be you have the two polar opposites, the market liberalism and competitiveness on one side, and state support and sort of backwardsness on the other, and it's whereas it's the trick is to handle both somewhere in the middle, because that's what happens in China today, that you suddenly you open all these free trade zones and pour a lot of money into it and try to make everything competitive. But when you don't have formal institutions that are focusing on quality, you have nothing to sell. Nothing is stimulated. Nothing is created.
James, how is the discussion in the Russian context when it comes to the division of powers within the statecraft of the, division of legislative and judiciary powers? Sorry, they are the same, aren't they? But I mean executive and legislative powers, and also the separation of church and state and religion. Is there a discussion in the Russian context in this?
I think it's very significant because I don't think there is any independence between any of these sectors. I mean, the Duma is a one-party body, essentially. These anti-gay laws I talked about before passed unanimously. And so pretty much whatever Putin wants, he can send through the Duma, and it has the appearance, a facade of democratic assent. There's no such thing. The court system is completely politicized. Obviously, the whole Khodorkovsky case, which just a couple weeks ago, we saw the 10th anniversary of him being sent to prison. Alexei Navalny, who is really the major opposition leader at this point, very politicized judiciary proceedings targeting critics of the regime. You've seen a major crackdown on the NGO sector. And then in replacement of that, you have these sort of fake NGOs that the Russian government supports that give a kind of patina of showing that there's some kind of fake NGO sector when the real NGO sector has been totally destroyed and foreign NGOs have been kicked out.
I think we were turning to China and Confucianism, or would it be Islam and the wax this time?
Or both. I would like to broaden the issue slightly, and maybe even adding something Indian into it. And the question is the source of law, if it is divine or human. And to give you an example, that early Christianity had to develop accounting rules for managing the communal, the congregational property. But you didn't find any accounting rules in the Bible, so the early church leaders had to invent their own rules. And this became the source of canonical law, which eventually became also inspiration for the Justinian codification of Roman law. And here you have religion entered the concept of law created by man, while the Sharia law has a divine origin. The gate of interpretation was locked sometime around the year 1000. And you had in India, you had the Veda scriptures, which were the source of how you should behave in the Hindu Brahmin culture. And here you can see how the ban on interpretation, or the ban on the possibility of interpretation, locks a society into having to obey the law as it is interpreted by the priesthood. You can't change it. So I think that's
the source of law.
It's always human.
Well,
Come on.
that depends on what you believe in, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah, believe, yes. But I would argue it's all human. It's all interpretations.
But could I just there is this Sultan Suleiman the Great. He is actually known as the Kanuni, which means the lawgiver. One of the Turkish president's wives once presented him as he was a great love maker, but he was a lawmaker. But he was a lawmaker, and his Turkish name Kanuni is actually because he actually introduced secular laws that were taken from the canons, that is, the canonical laws, in contrast with Sharia. And this was the 17th century. So, there is a bit sometimes the, shall we say, Bernard Lewis interpretation that all the sultans did were that they were giving Sharia laws. It's obviously not correct in a sense, because there are historical precedents of Ottoman sultans also introducing secular laws. I guess in the end, all law is human, depending on what you believe in. But Eli,
I think that your claim is interesting, but I think on the other hand that it's depending on what others are saying, which means if you have a situation in society which we have had historically, that you have religious leaders, that those are the ones who can read and write, they can claim that law is coming from God. And as they are authorized and know to read and write and so on, they are also the only ones that have the right to change the law. But as I said before, knowledge or education have changed the understanding of where law comes from dramatically. You have that in the Christian Reformation as a great example of how suddenly people started to read the Bible by themselves and so on, and how those religious authorities lost a little bit of power, and how finally other religious authorities had to adjust the law to reality. So it really doesn't matter if it comes from above or if you understand that it's created by human. The question is what happens with it at the end. And at the end, what will happen with it is what people want it to happen with it.
James, I guess in Western Christianity there is this old saying that goes back to a saying of Jesus of render unto Caesar what Caesar's and to God what's God. But in Eastern Christianity there isn't that tradition, obviously. So what was the source of law in Russia, and what is the source of... Well, you mentioned what the source of law was today in Russia. It's obviously Putin's brain. But in general... So how was the source of law interpreted in the Eastern European or Russian context?
I'm not an expert on Eastern Christianity as a faith. I can talk more about today, but there's actually a front page story in the International New York Times, as it's now called, about how defendants in court trials are put in cages in the courtroom, and how this is actually not anywhere in any Russian law. It's just by practice. And you see this in Egypt as well, Morsi sitting in a cage. And it's obviously, you know, as Westerners, although I read that they actually do it in Britain and France as well, which I was shocked to hear. You know, any, I think, liberal Western understanding of justice, this obviously presumes guilt when you put someone in a cage in a courtroom. But this is just sort of the way things are done in Russia, and there's no legal basis for it. It's sort of a diktat. And I think you see that with a lot of things in Russia. If you actually read the Russian Constitution today, it has a lot of nice sounding things about free speech and freedom of association. And I'm sure in many Islamic dictatorships, it says a lot of these things as well. But in practice, it's a completely different story.
Well, the 1936 Constitution of Stalin also was, I guess, considered as a very free constitution. Since no one else is asking, you have also spoken. Mats, great. But I will get back to you two gentlemen.
Okay, I was thinking about Russia and the opposition. You mentioned Navalny a couple of times, and one discussion about him is his connection to nationalism, and maybe hardcore nationalism. Yesterday on Homeland, somebody said that he had discovered corruption in Iran, and the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said, "Oh, corruption in Iran, so it's Tuesday." And maybe it's the same in Russia, that if you're in politics in Russia, you have to be more or less hardcore nationalism. Is he a good guy? Should we cheer for him, or should we give up hope already now?
My understanding of Navalny and the nationalists is that he's tried to... There's this march that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, and he's encouraged his own supporters to take part so that it is not seen and characterized as a far-right nationalist movement. I think that a lot of the slurs that have been directed against him, portraying him as a nationalist, are Kremlin, or they come from the Kremlin. They're false. They're wrong. That said, he has made some comments about Georgia that most of us would probably not agree with. But that, you have to understand, is a majority opinion in Russia. So any sort of viable opposition leader is not going to be a fan of Saakashvili. So I think it's the best you're going to get at this point.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So no, it was just a comment in the discussion where the laws come from. I mean, there's not the two options from men on the forum. God, there's also a third option, the natural law, which is obviously very disregarded in general in Sweden in the discussion about legality. But I think in this context it should be considered. Thank you.
recently read an interview with a young Muslim who looked at his iPhone, where he had an app of the Quran, and he said that I hope, or he thought that iPhone was making for Islam what Gutenberg did for Christianity. So in the beginning, man created God in his own image.
Yeah, just first with regards to Russia, I mean, Ivan the Terrible declared himself metropolitan, which is sort of like archbishop in the Orthodox Church, so I suppose it's closer then. But going back to Islam again, I mean, Ile said something very interesting about the step that women take, and then they can't be shoved off from that step. If you look at the Arab Spring then and the Islamic parties, which initially some people said, well, you know, this is the democratic experiment happening. These are the people who they are voting for, and then it turned out to be slightly, well, more in democracy in terms of voting, less freedom, right? Could you make an analysis? Is it comparable that, you know, once the step is taken, in sort of in one way, then it's going to continue, or are these Islamic parties that formally stand in elections, kind of like, you know, one man, one vote, one time, then we're going to push it back again?
I could comment that with two ways. The first one is that what is significant between those countries or societies where we have election and Islamic parties have gained power is unfortunately that it has or been done by power or only because of two alternatives. You can compare the elections in Egypt with the elections in Gaza, where Hamas gained power. My understanding of the elections in Egypt was much more that people wanted to get rid of the military than they wanted to get Muslims or Muslim Brotherhood. Not everybody wanted the consequence of what happened, but when I was there during the elections and I spoke to people, my understanding was that it was exactly the same thing in Gaza. People wanted in Gaza to get rid of Arafat and his people. They hoped for something cleaner and better. And the same thing in Egypt. People wanted to get rid of the military, the last part of the military, everyone that was connected with the military. And because of that, they chose the opposite. It was not an election between several different options, several different parties that could establish people. And don't forget that the only movement that had the ability to mobilize something politically, a movement, was the Muslim Brotherhood. All the others had a couple of months time and so on. Saying that, there was a research done by Kurtzman and another person. You can find it in the Journal of Democracy. They checked out 93 elections where Muslim parties were involved all over the world. And basically what they discovered was that when Islamic parties gain power, or more like that, the more a society is free, and that freedom has a consequence for the individual, the Islamic parties are losing power. They have two options. Or they are changing their platform or their ideology, or they lose power. Those are the two. But they are also taking the Middle East as something very, very special. The systems in the Middle East, whatever happened in the Middle East, is something special. But altogether, they checked out 93 different elections and the consequences of them. And their understanding is that if a society, again, formal political institutions, the society functions, Muslim parties are voted in a reasonable way, the democratic system is giving consequences to individuals that get a better life, more education, and so on. Islamic parties have two options. Or they change their ideology, or they lose power.
More or less. Now, just a second. I'd like to change the perspective in a way to some areas that are not your fields of expertise, but you'll have to answer in any case. Because, well, looking at Huntington's book on how the division of the civilizations, it actually starts with the West and the rest. So let's talk about the West now, because here we have actually spoken about the clash of civilization, but only from the perspectives of what is vulgarly called the rest. We have Europe, we have the Americas, United States, and we have Latin America, and then we have Africa. Who wishes to speak about any of these four other civilizations in this perspective of the Islamic world, China, and Russia? But you're an American. No, well, say something about America and the Europe. Well, you have said so many things about these other civilizations. I guess we could also drag in the other four or five other civilizations of the world in the Huntingtonian perspective. So, I mean, will America lose power, its dominance versus China? Will Chinese soft power ever become as large as even Bollywood or Hollywood? Will Africa emerge? Will we all be speaking Spanish in 200 years, or will English prevail?
This is a very popular talking point.
Yeah, go ahead.
The decline of America. And there's actually a new book out now by Josef Joffe, the German intellectual, called The Myth of American Decline, which I highly suggest you read. And I can't go through all the numbers right now, but if you look at all the indicators from GDP to education to military spending, this is completely nonsense, the notion that China will overtake America within the next 100 or 200 years. I mean, this is complete and utter nonsense. And the whole declinism of America is a trope that goes back to the founding of the country in the 18th century. And Europeans in particular have loved to forecast the downfall of America. And you can go back and you can read, Europeans who visited America in the 18th century and then later in the 19th century, and it's the same thing over and over and over again. This is a decadent society. It's really remarkable, the similarity and the consistency in what people have said. So I don't buy it. As much as I may disagree with what the Obama administration is doing foreign policy-wise in terms of its defense cuts, in terms of its posture in the Middle East, I don't think that this is anything catastrophic in terms of America's relationship vis-a-vis China or its position as global hegemon.
Well, actually, when the helicopters crashed on the Iranian desert in 1978, or was it 79 during the Carter administration, nobody quite imagined that Reagan would come. And then everybody was against America, more or less, but nobody spoke about the American decline during the Reagan years. So it's probably...
in the 80s, it was Japan. Yeah. Japan was going to overtake America. This was the cover of every magazine. And now look where Japan is, and where it's been for the past 20 years.
Oh, will the Chinese overtake America ever? Or
no, I was going to talk about Europe, actually.
Even better.
Well, basically both Europe and America, for NGOs, for artists, for individuals who are fighting for human rights in terms of freedom of speech, transparency, rule of law in China. For a long time, Europe and America has worked as sort of role models, both because of the democracy, but also because of transparency, rule of law, and so on. And I just want to go back to your comment about Edward Snowden and how he has become a pawn in Putin's game. Unfortunately, he has also become a pawn in the game of the Chinese authorities, but sort of the different way around, because the NSA files is sort of the perfect counter-argument to these NGOs, individuals who are fighting for transparency in China, because let's look at Snowden's. You've been doing exactly the same, and your people are not reacting. Why should we? Isn't that a problem?
I think that's a very cynical argument. I just do. I mean, there are no NGOs or journalists being arrested in the middle of the night and being shut down in the United States. I think that the revelations that have come out from WikiLeaks and Snowden have been vastly distorted and exaggerated. And I think The Guardian and Der Spiegel and other news outlets have played a very irresponsible role in how they've reported on what's actually contained in these documents. That said, I think spying on Chancellor Merkel's personal phone was a mistake. I don't believe the president when he says he didn't know about it. It's actually scarier if he didn't know about it than if he did know about it. And also, the German chancellor should not be using a cell phone to conduct secure communications on that. But I just think that, yes, I agree. This has been very bad for America's image. But I think people need to honestly.
And it undermines America as an authority on transparency
It
and
does.
human rights.
I think it does for people who aren't willing to read beyond the headlines, the sensationalist headlines. Because when these revelations, you ask most people in the world today, and they think, America is listening to my phone conversations and my emails. They're collecting metadata, which is this very complicated, it's numbers and interactions. They're not actually listening to phone conversations of everyone. They're not reading the emails of everyone. It's incredibly narcissistic, I think, this European response. I think there was a German columnist, there was a German columnist who said, why would the Americans want to spy on the EU so they can read about different sizes of potatoes and vegetables, and what would they possibly... And I think there's a real sort of narcissism in the outrage that's being expressed by a lot of Europeans who don't understand that their true friend is the United States and their adversary is Russia and China, and they're being played. They're being played by the Chinese and the Russians, and they're playing right into Putin's hands.
Well, let's move on to the... Well, now here we go. There was a couple of persons who asked for the floor who hasn't spoken. Yes, I noticed you. So I will take all your 3 questions first, and I will remember you as well. And those who have had the floor before, I will get back to you as well. This is the sponsor, so I have to start.
Okay, my question is about our culture and how it influences the other civilizations, and in particular China. And do we have any soft power in China? What kind of influx do we have? No. In a broader sense, the Western ideas, Western values. What kind of music do they listen to? Movies? What kind of movies do they watch? What do they read?
I mean, the Western world in that sense definitely still has a lot of soft power, a lot of access to cultural consumers in China. The US even more than Europe, I'd say. But the main import culture, the countries they will feel closest to would be South Korea and Japan. If you're going to look from a sort of cultural diplomacy perspective. I think that the overall more ideological soft power influence that especially the US but also Europe has in the past 3 years is somewhat on the decline, partly because of the financial crisis, but also I still maintain, I think, cases such as, like you said, of course, it's sensationalist, it's headlines, but after all, that's what reaches the people. That's what they respond to, and the sort of the basic detail bottom line, I still think is not okay. That's what people pick up on, and the people it influences in China would be human rights activists, people pushing for rule and law, transparency, and so on. Yes.
You said that they watch South Korean movies, Japanese movies, listen to the music from there. But from a conflict point of view, just dragging Huntington back into the... if you didn't know it, this was supposed to Huntington. So I'm just saying, you know. But anyway, China has really problems with all its neighbors, nearly. I mean, there's so many conflicts around here. So how does that play into the fact that on the one hand they are actually listening to their music, watching their movies, and also trying to grab their islands? You know, how do they square that?
Well, I think I would put it very basic, like you said about Putin. He's very pragmatic. So is China, both in terms of politics, but also the way the whole society works. I mean, you have on the one hand you have a strong nationalistic movement that is on the rise, but at the side of this, you also have, an increasing middle class and increasingly educated and a middle class with access to the internet, to the rest of the world, and their demands are higher. They want quality, and because of what I've explained, how the system works, that's very hard for China to deliver at the moment.
Right. So they really need the other countries to sustain the.
If you've ever
middle
watched a Chinese TV show like a sitcom and then compare it to a South Korean one, it's obvious why.
Okay.
So.
Clear
I
pattern of influence.
I think it's that simple. That is, most people are not in their daily lives are not driven by ideology or by nationalism in that sense. It's on the contrary. It's a very individualistic culture, China today. It's like everyone is sort of focusing on their lives, their consumption, and to the point where if you lose this group skills, that becomes particularly evident in the creative industries. So I don't think that's a contradiction at all. One great exception, of course, is this Diaoyudao Senkaku debate, where Japanese factories actually had to shut down. They set fire to Japanese cars for a while, but that particular conflict has such deep historical roots, as opposed to, for instance, now the South China Sea situation, where there's no sense of shame the same way.
Turkish TV shows are very popular in the Arab world, so you can imagine the quality of Arab television.
Appalling.
Yes, my question is more of a scholarly question, perhaps. I was thinking, what are your commentaries, perhaps, on more traditional IR theory, international relations theory, and how do you relate, like, the more state-centric approaches, like realism and liberalism, that focus on security, self-help, the international anarchy, complex interdependence, and such? How do you relate these traditional IR theories to the clash of civilizations? Is the clash of civilizations better at explaining international conflict today than the big international relations theories, the traditional ones, basically?
Well, when anyone of the PhD deserted academicians.
Why do you look at me?
Well, there's Shell Goldman is unfortunate not among us.
No.
But please.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe John Mearsheimer, one of the great realist thinkers, if you want to consider him that, he was saying in the early 90s that Germany was going to become a nuclear power, a nuclear armed power. Completely bonkers and completely wrong. I don't like looking at the world through these sort of IR, political science goggles. I think it doesn't allow for the chaos or just the variety of things that can happen. So I was a political science major in college. It was a real bad choice on my part. It did not equip me to analyze global politics, I don't think. I think it's too narrow a way of viewing things. It's not a puzzle that all fits together so easily as these IR scholars try to make it be.
I'll second that. Absolutely, I totally agree. And I am a political scientist, but I would discard that. The quicker you get rid of it, the better.
It's better to be a regionalist, to actually study a country, study its history. History is far more better at telling you what might happen or explaining the world than political science.
And making an allowance for the chaos.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah. There is a French sociologist written a book called The New Paradigm. His name is Alain Tourin. And he is actually talking about the fact that we have to see the world in a different pattern right now, because there are a lot of things that doesn't work. We can't use them as tools to understand anymore, like society, countries, and so on, because we live in a globalized society. People are moving a lot from one place to another. Things look different than they do today. And I believe that the line or clashes, whatever those clashes might be, is much less, according to his theory, it would be much less according to culture or religion, even though, according to his claim, we become much more individuals than we have been before. We're much more completed entities than we were before because we claim identities in sex, we're men or women, we claim religious identities, ethnic identities. It's very important to every individual to be more individual than to be a group of something. So what actually is left, from my point of view, is to see people that are in favor of societies that are free and people that are more comfortable to live in authoritarian societies. And I think those exist because living in a free society requires responsibility. It requires something from you as an individual. It's not totally obvious that everyone everywhere would prefer that for any price. And I think that line that we see, and we see different groups in Europe like far radical left, far radical right, Islamist groups, for instance, that are very radical. We have groups that are looking for systems that would be like more controlling, less free, and I think that that is the line that we should look on rather than cultures, societies, or countries.
Yes, I will make some reflections going through history. I believe that Eli wanted to say that there are so many failed states in the Middle East among the Muslim countries, which is true, but they have also inherited their history. Their history was from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They were colonies of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed, these countries were immediately colonized. They never had any chance of real liberty or the development of any civil society in the means that we use when we talk about democratic systems in the West. And the West did not do anything to help them either. On the contrary, the colonization continued, and then oil was discovered, and maintaining all the old systems in place until the revolutions that started in Tunis 2 years ago. So we have failed them, and we can see what is the result. Another strategy of the extremism is spreading in Africa now. Boko Haram in Nigeria is a real threat for Africa. And I think we have to look what is the background. Is it failed state, or is it frustration among the young people who have nowhere to go, no ideological systems except some radical or extremist religious leaders who promise them anything but reality. And about China, I grew up in China. It's very interesting to see that you missed Confucius altogether. I think what the Chinese are trying to do is to recreate a new Chinese man, the new identity. And they have no ambition whatsoever to conquer the world. Thank you.
So, does anyone wish to pick up the issue of the West and the Middle East?
Yes, as the question or as the statement claimed that I said something about fake states and so on. Well, number one, I never said that. Number two, of course there is a responsibility for the colonial powers, but I believe that one of the biggest responsibilities of the failure of the Arab countries are the Arab countries by themselves. I think, for instance, that the Ba'ath Party, which was meant to be a socialistic Arab unity, or the idea of pan-Arabism, was not something that came from nowhere or came from West to destroy the Arab countries. It was Michel Aflaq's idea about a socialistic system in the Arab countries might have been a good idea, but it very fast changed into Arabic dictatorships where Arab officers took power in Syria and Iraq and Egypt and so on. And the Assad family saw themselves as an extension of Arab history. Nasser saw himself as a new pharaoh. Saddam Hussein drew a connection between him personally and Nebuchadnezzar and so on. And that had very little to do with West. It had more to do with what came after when Soviet Union, for instance, went in and helped these powers to oppress their own people with their good understanding. So I don't believe in that colonial responsibility that we have to drag with us the whole time. But I do think, on the other hand, that Arabs or Arab nations are smart enough, intelligent enough, powerful enough, and capable enough to create good society by themselves. And I'm not sure that they need so much of our help, but rather more of our support. And I think there is a great difference between help and support.
On this question, I think it's fair to blame, colonialism for some extent. But in Egypt in particular, as an American, when I've been to Egypt, you hear all the time, oh, it was the Americans who propped up Mubarak. And without the Americans and this Mubarak guy would have never come. BS. I mean, he is a very natural Egyptian leader, going back hundreds of years throughout Egyptian history, and the military has played a strong role. He was a popular guy. He didn't need $2 billion from America every year to stay in power. That's just not true. And in terms of taking things from the West, if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood, Paul Berman has written about this, they took a lot from the Nazis. And Islamism is in many ways reminiscent of European fascism. It has many of the same themes. So if they can take that from Europe, then I don't see why they couldn't also adopt more liberal ideas as well.
Yes. Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with your thought that there's a strong sort of identity seeking in China today, in the people, and especially that comes out through culture. I don't think that China is out to conquer the world either. However, it's there's definitely a stated goal from the Chinese Communist Party and in Chinese cultural policy to sort of change its model of economic growth from cheap manufacturing, from polluting, cheap labor-intensive industries to a more creative, intellectual industries. And as a part of that, it is a stated goal for Chinese authorities to reach a level where they can compete on the world market along with the United States. However, China also wishes to do this on her own terms, and this is where it becomes problematic, because it's if you look at the Confucius Institutes, for instance, which was sort of the first line of this, they just categorically exclude everything that is modern on the culture side of things. It's only the traditional classical culture, and the Chinese policymakers have made this model where you can sort of you take the American economic model for culture and you put Chinese traditional culture into this that doesn't have to deal with any problematic modern questions, and it just doesn't work like that. To talk about Confucianism in this context, someone said to me in the break that this whole authoritarian structure, does that have to do with the Communist Party, or is it the Confucian culture that is like this? And it's yes, on the one hand, Confucian culture is sort of very hierarchical. It's based on respecting your parents, respecting your teachers. However, if you look at Chinese history, if you look at all the tremendous, innovative, creative achievements it has had up until the late 1930s, it is obvious that you can have an authoritarian or a hierarchical structure that still allows room for innovation, for originality, that rewards creativity. But that's what is lacking today, and I think this doesn't have to do with a Confucian society. This has got to do with the traumas after the Cultural Revolution, and also the 20 years of communist rule before that, where all culture was sort of streamlined and recipe based. And artists, creative people in China today have grown up in a system where everyone is scarred by this Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping, China's leader, his father was in prison. He lived in a cave for many years. I mean, he still promotes Maoism. It's this huge elephant in the room that no one talks about, and that influences everything. And so there's basically it's a sort of fear. Of doing anything wrong, a fear of being visible, of sticking your head out, of taking risks, and that's what's and that's what's created this. It's not the Confucian culture per se, because I think it's. I mean, if anyone can boast great cultural achievements, it's the Confucian culture.
Thank you. We are actually finishing up with the gentleman in red and Mr. Arpi at the background. On all the other gentlemen who have spoken several times, I won't give the floor to you because we are rounding up. Please.
Okay, thank you. So one way at looking at looking at these discourses of increased economic competitiveness is that they feel the function to preserve the dominant power structures. Because let's face it, the world is becoming a smaller place, and some scholars, more recently, such as Russell Jacoby, has taken up the old idea of Sigmund Freud, this idea of narcissism of minor differences, which says that the smaller differences become between people, the more emphasis there will be on those small differences. And so, I mean, if there is anything that we learned, especially from the first two presentations, I mean, it's pragmatic politics in Russia, right? And it's about commercial interests in China. It's not about culture, it's not about civilizations. And therefore, I would like to ask the gentleman who actually read Huntington's book. But I mean, after having created this category, I mean, after dividing up the world into these categories that are actually very problematic, according to many, you said that he still goes on and somehow, I mean, tries to avoid the situation. But what it is that he tries to do, because he has been very influential in influencing, policymakers and so on.
Could you just take one more question, the final one, and then the panel could round up?
Yes, I would just like to pose a question about the anti-Westernism in Islam, in Russia, in China, in large parts of Latin America. What obstacle does that make for Westernization or for democratization? Because for a lot of these, if you don't want to use the word civilizations, but cultures or the West represents some form of decadence or something that is wrong and something you have to internally strengthen yourself towards. So how does that affect the prospect for freedom or democracy in these parts?
Thank you. So I love this phrase, the narcissism of small differences, because sometimes I think very much that's what we are indulging in all the time, aren't we? But the question about pragmatism from the Russian and the Huntington's ending words, I was actually going to read them out as finishing the session, so I don't have to be too specific on that. And then, of course, the question about anti-Westernism, which is glad that you brought it up, because there are some common denominators, after all, in these issues that we have spoken about. And finally, someone asked me, is anyone going to speak about Africa and Boko Haram, which was brought up too. It's voluntarily, of course. Shall we just round it up and start where we, in the fashion that in the order that we had in the beginning, that Jamie is the first and the last. Your last interlocution will be the first for rounding up, and then we go to Oda and to Magnus and Eli.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit too much emphasis put on sort of global public opinion when it comes to anti-Western or more specifically anti-American attitudes. It's always fashionable to hate the big guy on the block. And so anti-Americanism has been around for a very long time. And you can actually look at poll numbers, surprisingly, right after World War II in France, having been liberated from fascism by the United States, over 50% having negative attitudes towards the US. And this has just been a constant, I think, throughout the world. And I don't think that the United States or the West in general should base its policies on global popularity, because a lot of global publics or public opinion in countries are things that we would find repulsive and crazy. I mean, you could probably find, you know, majorities in many Muslim countries supporting, I don't know, stoning women or hanging homosexuals. We wouldn't adopt those policies in order to appease a foreign population. So I think that President Obama came into office being very humble and apologizing and trying to distinguish himself from his predecessors. And look where it's got him. I mean, the world is a mess, and it's not, he's done as much as he can to really prostrate on the global stage, and I don't think it's earned America, in terms of hard policy terms, that much goodwill, or it's improved America's position in the world. So I don't think that obviously you have to take public opinion into account, and you don't want to go around deliberately angering and provoking people. But at the end of the day, what should drive the West's approach to the world is our values and our interests. And I think more often than not, they are in alignment.
Thank you for that very nice sort of summing it up. I haven't prepared sort of an end speech, so this is going to be spontaneous. I'm sorry about that. Basically, I want to go back to what you said about this new cultural boom in China, not having anything to do with it's not civilization based at all, but it's more about economic policy, and I think that's absolutely right, that it is driven for this whole soft power cultural industry boom is driven by a need China has to reform its model of economic growth and production. However, although I've pointed out many negative things today, I don't think increased investment in the cultural sector really on a long-term basis can be a bad thing. And I think that also if we are critical but interested in the way we look at all these cultural products that are now going to be coming out of China, I think that's definitely going to be a growth in what we see in Europe. As well, it also has the potential of being a good force that can bring the Western and the Chinese civilizations closer together, to end on a positive note.
Let me start with Huntington. I'm not so sure if he's been that influential. You know, it was talked about a lot, but as I said, it was more about the debate about the debate. I'm not so sure that his actual theories were that influential in shaping foreign policy. So I'm not sure I agree with that actually at all. It's influential in the way that we talked about the debate, in a sense, and then we talked about the civilizations, but not specifically from a theory point of view at all. On the issue of critique against the West, I agree with James here. I also think it's very much used as a way of, you know, the way you mentioned in China. Look what they do. You know, how can you ask us to do? Look what they're doing. It's a way of explaining away and avoiding hard decision of actually truly reforming and liberalizing a society. It's much more to do with that. And again, one should be very, very, very careful when you talk about, you know, public opinion worldwide. You know, that's a very, very fuzzy notion at the beginning. So I'd be very careful with that notion. I can't say more about Huntington because Thomas is going to read.
I would address the question of Ivar Arpi there and start by a very little short part of Tom Friedman, economist, made a film where he tried to find the reasons for those who are the suicide bombers. So he's traveling around the Muslim world, and he's coming up to a guy that shouts at him in a TV studio in Jordan, shouts and says, "The America garbage," and so on. It goes on and goes on. Tom Friedman looks at him for a while and says, "So why did you stay there for 5 years? You're educated in the United States. You lived in the United States for 5 years. So what's your problem?" Same situation again when it comes to Pakistan, and he's told that America is horrible and so on. So he stands up and said, "I have one scholarship. I can get one of you to the States to study. Is anyone interested?" Everybody wanted to go there. I think there is a contradiction. I think the contradiction or the issue as far as concerns the Arab world and West has a lot to do with the lack of self-confidence. And the lack of self-confidence is not West's problem, or it's not because of West, but it has to understood where it comes from and see the reasons behind it and approach it that way. I don't think either that the West, if there is a clash of civilization in that case, as far as concerns Middle East, Arab world, and Europe and United States, I don't think that the West can do so much to change that. I don't think that West has to change its values. I don't think that West has to soften up its attitude. I do think it has to be understood, though, that it's a matter of lack of self-confidence, and how that self-confidence should be rebuilt. That's a very, very hard question. But I think that something happened in Egypt at Tahrir Square. I think that confidence issue, we're talking about identity buildings, and we're talking about the global world and so on. I think that people that rise against the power and feel that somehow the power is taking back to the individual, or back to the streets if you so want, or back to the civil society, is also regaining the self-confidence. I think that with that regain of self-confidence doesn't necessarily mean that from that point on everybody would love West, but I think it becomes an easier way to have a dialogue in the future. But it's a matter of confidence, and the way it looks right now, it doesn't look good.
So thank you very much, and by these final remarks from the panel, and I would like to conclude by just pointing out that at the end of his book, at 321 pages, Huntington actually points out that although the humankind might be divided, Western Christianity, Orthodoxy, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Confucianism, Taoism, and Judaism also share key values in common. And if humans wish to develop a universal civilization, it will emerge gradually through the exploration and expansion of these commonalities. And then he introduces civilization with a big C, as contrast to the others, the 7 civilizations he has. And he says that in clash of civilizations, that is with a small c, Europe and America will hang together or hang separately. In the greater clash, the global real clash between civilizations with a capital C and barbarism, the world's great civilizations with their rich accomplishments in religion, art, literature, philosophy, science, technology, morality, and compassion will also hang together or hang separately. In the emerging era, clashes of civilizations are the greatest threat to world peace, and an international order based on civilization is the surest safeguard against world war. So with these prophetic words of Huntington, and a prophecy that hasn't been fulfilled yet, as you might have noticed around the world, we would like to finish this session and also congratulate you, all the interested audience, that we have been discussing Huntington for like 4 hours now without stop. So thank you very much, and thank you so much for the panelists and our organizers.